Welcome to the Presbyterian Heritage Center and our treasures from the attic. Museums always have hundreds, if not thousands, of artifacts, archival materials that are squirreled away in safe storage that never really see the light of day. So one of the things we want to do for the next 3 weeks is to bring you a glimpse of some of the things, the treasures that are in our attic that represent different things. Today, we're going to take a look at some Presbyterian and some Montreat artifacts, photos, pictures. We have some Montreat Souvenirs we'll show you in a few minutes. And then next week, we will focus more on missions. And then the third week of this showing on Wednesday, June the 23rd, we will deal with some of the Civil War items that we have in our collection. The first thing I'd like to talk about is a magic lantern. This is the magic lantern. Well, what is a magic lantern? Well, it's the precursor to a slide projector. In the late 1700s, they would have a magic lantern. It would be illuminated by candle power. Very dim image, but allow you to project things and show things. Well, gradually through the 19th century, they improved, and with electricity, they got more powerful bulbs that they could install. This is a machine, it's a stereo Octagon, it's called. It was built in 1916. It was used in Montreat. And what it was used for was to project glass lantern slides. Now, you won't be able to see this, but this is the image, originally black and white only, that they put between two pieces of glass, and it became a positive image that they could then project for a group at a meeting. And this particular glass lantern slide shows assembly in. And I'm going to put this over here so we can zoom in on it. You'll notice that it's in color. Well, what that is actually, it's the black and white photograph that originally taken and then hand colored. And it has, therefore, some very vivid greens and reds and different kinds of colors. And the colors may not be accurate because someone doing the coloring may not have actually ever seen the original building that had a photograph had been taken care of. So this is the slide projector of 150 years ago, 120 years ago. Now, the other thing I wanted to show you today was a movie lobby card. And this movie lobby card says, "The Two-Gun Man." Why does the Presbyterian Heritage Center in its collection have a movie lobby card? Well, the picture we're showing here was that your cell phone? Okay, I'll pick up. So this movie lobby card shows two cowboys. And the cowboy in the white hat is Fred Thompson.
Of course he's in the white hat.
Of course, because he's the hero. And what you have to do is, there's an interesting story about Fred. Fred comes from is a minister's son, a Presbyterian minister's son. He's very gifted athletically. He's 6'2". He competes and was invited to go to the 1912 Olympics and compete in the decathlon. He decided to go to Princeton Theological Seminary instead. But he was such a good athlete that he actually would outscore Jim Thorpe when they were setting world records for the decathlon. So after he graduated from Princeton Theological Seminary, he was ordained and went back to California, his hometown, his home state, and became a Presbyterian minister. Later, he moved to Nevada to do a church there, and his young wife passed away. This is getting around 1917, 1918, and America decided to enter the war that was known as the Great War or the World War One. And he became a chaplain to an army unit, first in California, and then later shipped over to France. Now, the interesting thing is, while he was at the army base in California, Mary Pickford, America's sweetheart actress, came to visit. This was her troop that she sort of adopted, so they called her Colonel Pickford. Well, Colonel Pickford got together for a publicity picture with Lieutenant Chaplain Fred Thompson, and there's the picture of her when she visited the army base. When she came back to the army base, she brought her personal friend, Frances Marion. Now, Frances Marion was one of the directors, female directors in the silent era in Hollywood. There were a lot of female directors in Hollywood in the silent era, and they got pushed aside by the studios. Frances Marion, though, also was a screenwriter, so she was able to continue her career. Well, one day when she was directing a movie, the actor didn't show up. So Frances Marion pressed into service her very attractive 6'2", blue-eyed Adonis husband, Fred Thompson, and he became a movie star. Now, in the 1920s, there were two Western stars that fought it out for top box office draw. One was Fred Thompson, who occasionally won, and the other was Tom Mix. Now, they both worked for local studios, and at this time, Fred Thompson worked for FBO, which stands for Film Booking Offices. The person who owned FBO, or FBO Pictures, as it later came to be called, was Joseph P. Kennedy. If that makes it sounds familiar, well, yes, Joseph P. Kennedy was the father of Joe and Jack Kennedy. And at the age of 6 or 7, the future president of the United States, Jack Kennedy, went to see his favorite Western movie star, Fred Thompson, which is an interesting connection, I think.
It sounds like a story of predestination. This is incredible.
Not only predestination, but a real
circumstances
and a mystery, because people today know of Tom Mix, but nobody knows of Fred Thompson. Well, what happened? Well, Fred Thompson and his wife built a ranch in the hills above Malibu about 1926, and it had a stable. And one day, nearing Christmas 1928, his wife saw that he was limping. And she said, "What's the problem?" And he said, "Oh, it's just an injury." Well, he had stepped on a rusty nail and ended up dying on Christmas Day, 1928, before talkies came to Hollywood. So the result is he got lost in the public's memory banks because he didn't go over into the talking movie era. So that's a little story about.
But thank goodness for the Presbyterian Heritage Center that kept his name from being lost. So
yes.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. And what happens is, that's one of the things we try and do, is to do original research to try and find out more about Montreat and Presbyterian history, and then to preserve that information. Our slogan is honoring the past, informing the present, influencing the future.
May
Now,
I ask a question?
Sure.
If perhaps, did he ever return to the ministry, or?
No, when he married Frances Marion, she had been divorced 2 times. And this is an era when divorce was a problem for the church. And so he never went back to an active. After he was a chaplain with the army, he simply then fell into doing movie acting. And only 2 of his movies in their entirety remain today. One is a non-Western called The Love Light, where Mary Pickford is the star. and the other one is Thundering Hooves, one of his Western pictures.
I can see that being something that the Heritage Center might show sometime.
Yes, and we actually have a DVD of the Love Light. Now, one thing before we do Montreat Souvenirs is that I'd just like to get back to Montreat. We have an original letter here from our collection that we found recently, and it talks about July the 4th. You know, there's always a debate in Montreat as to when do we start recognizing July the 4th in Montreat and what was the celebration. And this is a letter by Elizabeth Foreman, chairwoman of the July 4th Table Committee. She was joined by Mrs. Lord, Miss Cooper, and Miss Martin. This is 1906. And basically it says, "Dear friends, will you not join us in an old-fashioned 4th of July celebration? Tables will be spread in the park opposite the Lycia Springs, to which you and your family are cordially invited to come and bring your basket lunch. Young ladies will be in attendance to receive the baskets at any time in the afternoon before 4 o'clock. Lunch will be served from 5 to 7. I don't know about you, but that's a little late for me to have my lunch. But we are always looking at letters and archival materials to find out more information. And the interesting thing is we keep finding new information. Now, one of the things that Mary has brought is Montreat Souvenirs, and I'd like her to talk about those and show you what she's got.
I brought a rather eclectic collection, and Ron has provided a good segue into one of those. There was a time, and still, that people collected souvenir teaspoons. This did not see the silver polish this morning. But here on the bowl is a picture of the old President's Lodge, which was at the corner of Assembly Drive in Louisiana.
There's
And
still a chimney left from that.
the chimney still stands. To my knowledge, it's the oldest man-made structure in Montreat.
Yes.
And it's in the Somerville yard, since we're among friends here. Don't go on their property to find it and scramble over it, but view it from the sidewalk there. And it probably dated from the time that Montreat was a sheep ranch.
Mm-hmm.
And was probably one of the sheep ranchers' cabins. But segueing into when the 4th of July celebrations started, we have a postcard called the Old President's Lodge, which is a bit of a misnomer because I don't think the president actually ever had an office there. But on the back of that card, which dates from around 07 to 08, there's a reference to the 4th of July celebration. And the timing is such, it says the airy ships flew overhead, which is interesting, the airy ships. And it said for the South, it was a pretty good 4th of July celebration. And think of that context. We were not that far from the Civil War. And so a lot of Northerners in town. This is pre-Presbyterian days, or right at that cusp. And so a pretty good 4th of July celebration for the South. So
That's very interesting.
yeah, so I'll get a copy of that.
Great.
The back of the card is often as interesting as the front of the card.
Now, what else do you have?
Um,
You've got teacups and wood pieces and
if you were visiting in the 20s and in the 30s, these are some of the things that you might have purchased as a souvenir from Black Mountain and from Montreat. This is a little teacup that one of the drugstores featured that you might have taken home with a picture of an old bridge crossing the Swannanoa River. And as close as we've been able to find out, this would have been about where the Pizza Hut is now. And there are people who still have memory of this bridge. But a fun little piece. And it's got a little note inside from the people who purchased it saying that was part of their visit. one of the other things that was collectible in that era of about, oh, I would say the 20s and the 30s were these wooden pieces. If you wanted to be in charge in Montreat,
Or try to be in charge.
never in charge in Montreat. But here is a Montreat Gavel, and it's engraved with Montreat on it. I've seen a couple of these around. One of the ways to date these things is, here's a little, you would have come to Montreat and probably have included Mount Mitchell on your trip. And at this point in time, you would have probably been on the Mount Mitchell toll road. It was open at that point in time. And you could hike, certainly, but on the toll road. And a lot of people came to Montreat as tourists and honeymooners and coming up and staying here forever. But this one you can date because it's a little calendar.
What's the year?
1925.
25.
So that makes them all easy, the date. This one I brought for Nancy Midget. It says Elon on this one. They're from, you can pick them up from all over Western North Carolina. This is a little Montreat picture. Whoops. We'll pick it up in a minute. There you go. Little Montreat picture.
That's great.
There you go.
Thank you.
And then this one is Black Mountain, North Carolina. So these are what your great-great-grandparents and aunts and uncles were collecting in the time. I would guess the teaspoon would be from the 30s and 40s when that was popular. And no one's ever had a firm date on when the cabin was actually torn down. So have tried to do some research
We'll have
on
to do some research here at the Heritage Center.
and maybe date the spoon. That's something that you could follow up on. For those of you who have more recent history, probably 40s, 50s, 60s, I'm not exactly sure, but the rug and jug. That was in the time of cigarettes. So this is a cigarette holder. And with now inappropriate, I think this is a caricature, perhaps of Indian, not sure on there, but something that would have been in that a different time. But it's actually it says Montreat, North Carolina. So maybe it was something purchased at the Rug and Jug as a souvenir of Montreat. And the Rug and Jug is now part of the Tyson store and is currently being remodeled. But if you walk there across from where the park is, the square, before the plywood boarding went up, it had the large ceramic rings on it. We'll see if they maintain to the remodeling or not. But anyway, so those are some of the things that you would take home with you to commemorate your trip to Montreat.
Thank you for bringing them.
Absolutely.
Another thing that you get strange artifacts when you're working at the Presbyterian Heritage Center, and we have one from Wright McCallum, and it is a conch shell. Now, the great question is, why does a seaside item belong in Montreat? Well, you won't be able to see this, but this is the conch shell. And they have cut a slit in the back of the conch shell. Now, why did they do that? Well, one of the people who used to contribute heavily to Montreat decided that there should be lighting, wall sconces, if you will, in Assembly Inn. And what I have here is a picture of the Montreat Assembly Inn lobby, and I'm going to ask the camera to go in close on it. If you look at the columns, you will see that there are these conch shells that are in various places that have a light bulb put in them. And that became a wall sconce or a column sconce for the lobby area in Montreat. And the saying was, well, why a seaside item in the mountains? And Robert Campbell Anderson, president of the Mountain Retreat Association, covered it nicely in a publicity move. He said, from the seashore to the mountains, Montreat is home to Presbyterians. And that sort of covered the bases. Now, between you and me, I think it was because the patron was not only a donor of conch shells, but she also probably wrote significant checks to Montreat for programming.
Can you tell from the picture, were the seashells horizontal or?
They were
Okay.
they were all horizontal. As
So
a matter
the
of fact,
light
if you
shone
look
up.
here,
I've never
the
seen
light
it.
shows up and it goes
Ah.
upward. So this would be against the column, and this is where the light bulb would be. And of course, these would be above your head, so you
Right.
couldn't see the exposed bulb. But that's an interesting picture we found, and it was done by Greg, I think, of Black Mountain, which dates it based upon the completion of assembly in late 1920, but more likely early 1930s, 31, 32.
Well, what's really nice about this picture, it shows the ceilings,
Yes,
and
which are now all covered
which are
up.
now covered. And mainly one of the interesting things too is that for some reason, he ran all of the plumbing and the electrical wires through the stone columns, up through the stone columns, which makes rewiring and remodeling
repairs.
problematic down the road.
Now, one of the other things that we'd like to talk about is the community center, which was built about 1900, 1901, was home to the Montreat Graded School. And this is a first annual report of the Montreat Graded School, 1903 to 1904. And in this report, it was filed by Chester Lord, who collected money from individuals. Montreat was always collecting money and still is collecting money for a variety of things, including the Presbyterian Heritage Center. But this is a listing of the school, the grades, and 3 teachers were hired in the first year. Mrs. Elizabeth Foreman, who did advanced grades, Miss Jeanette Beeson, intermediate grades, and Miss Ruth Christensen, primary and kindergarten. And we happen to have a picture circa 1904 of the graded school class. It's a dim picture, but if you go in on it, you can see they're standing in front of what is now the post office, but it began as the community center, the school for the graded school, and also for church services. And that this is something that we found in a collection that we've been processing, and it gives us firm dates and a real good background into that school.
Is that part of the Dr. Kenneth Foreman Jr.
It is part
collection?
of the Foreman collection that began well before Elizabeth and Kenneth, but yes, they've kept it up through the years, and we're very delighted to have it.
I was very careful to say Dr. Kenneth Foreman. He told me once there was never a Ken Foreman. There were always a Kenneth Foreman, but there was never a Ken Foreman.
There are 2 things we've also found information. We actually had a flood in 1906. Now, 1916 was the great flood that washed the dam out. But in 1906, there was another storm that washed the dam out. And it was the first time that the dam was washed out, which is why it's always been, why can't we get the dam to hold? It was a heavy downpour, and the actual date was January the 29th. And this is a newspaper story from February the 2nd. The dam at Montreat, which gave way Monday afternoon, let out a great volume of water that carried everything in its wide sweep. Mr. Suttles, the name well known in Black Mountain of that section, who conducts a livery or coach line business in Montreat, was in the city yesterday afternoon. He suffered considerably by the breaking of the dam. delivery stable, by the way, was basically where Assembly Drive is when you come in Assembly Road, and Swananoa
And
and
Shenandoah,
Shenandoah. I mean Shenandoah
along the
and
old
Assembly
Swananoa Creek, which was the
Yes.
original name
For Flat Creek.
For Flat Creek.
All of Suttle's vehicles were caught in the flood and washed downstream, some damaged and some carried away. All the small bridges were taken by the rush of water from the broken dam, and many telegraph and telephone poles were carried away. So that just is a new, deeper insight into the flood that we had known had occurred, but we didn't know any detail.
But it also says, interesting that it talks about the telegraph and the telephone lines
Yes.
in 1906, when you'll always think about electricity and telegraph being here.
Yeah, and I don't
and
know
that's
if they
pretty
were downstream outside of Montreat or in.
There's certainly postcards in that era that show telephone line, but it not telephone or telegraph poles at that point in time.
Now, the next thing is an article talking about a memorial to John Calvin. The community center served as a meeting place occasionally, not just for the school, but for conferences that came during the summertime. And it was fairly small, so they decided they needed a larger building. And so the General Assembly of the Southern Presbyterian Church in 1906 passed a resolution to the effect that $25,000 will be given to the Mountain Retreat Association to build a new auditorium. And it would also be a memorial to John Calvin. It opened on July the 19th, 1909 in Montreat. And the reason for that date was the 400th anniversary of the birth of John Calvin. So that just ties the Presbyterian history and founding to Montreat. Now, lastly, in today's little webinar meeting, I'd like to point out this sewing machine and sewing machine stand. This is the sewing machine and stand of Sadie Gaither Anderson, the wife of Robert Campbell Anderson. And it's a stand. It's not electric. It's all pedal movement to drive it. And Presbyterians with their Scottish roots are known as being somewhat frugal. Well, I find it interesting that Sadie Gaither Anderson sewing machine was from the Free Sewing Machine Company in Rockford, Illinois. Now, to close on sewing machines, we have letters, and you won't be able to see this on camera, but it's original manuscript letter. It was in the Halbert Green Hill collection. Now, Reverend Green was a Presbyterian minister and eventually became moderator of the Presbyterian Church in the United States. He also was at Maxton, North Carolina for a good number of years and ran a school there, as well as also helped as trustee of Union Theological Seminary in Richmond. Well, in the collection, we found a handwritten manuscript dialogue, a play that a couple people put together talking about the invention of sewing machines. This letter dates from the late 1860s, we believe. I just wanted to read it. It's a dialogue between two women about the invention of the sewing machine. Rose says, well, what new invention has prompted this tirade against mechanisms? And Anna answers, why, some masculine fiend has had the audacity to invent a sewing machine and thus to take away from a woman the scepter of the needle. Formerly, when there were rents to mend and garments to make, the lords of creation needed the aid of their wives, daughters, and sweethearts, and could come as supplicants. But now, alas, the scepter has departed. Bella, while you seem to talk like it was a great privilege to sew, when everybody knows it is the very plague of a woman's life. For my part, I'm glad that men have invented sewing machines, and I wish that they would invent knitting machines, scouring machines, and cooking machines. Well, Rose says, but don't you think the sewing machine will benefit women at last by giving them more time for reading and mental improvement? Anna, well, that's one of the plausible fallacies by which men endeavor to reconcile us to this innovation. But don't you know that most females spend their leisure not in reading and thinking, but in gadding and gossip? Now, I'm no prophetess, but mark my words, the prevalence of gossip will keep even pace with the introduction of the sewing machine, and the peace of society will be more disturbed by the unruly members than ever before. Bella, what if women do talk more on account of sewing machines? Let them talk, and the world will get wiser. Which I think is a great tongue-in-cheek satire over this whole issue of mechanical devices and labor saving in the Industrial Revolution. And we have a manuscript that deals with this in real time in the late 1860s, early 1870s. And I like this. I like the closing. Let them talk, and the world will get wiser. There's something to be said for that.
Well said.
Even today. Well, next issue of this particular webinar, we're going to take a look at missions and Presbyterians in Montreat. And in the third edition, which will come later this month, we will show some of the Civil War items that we have here, including chaplains, and how we rescued and have a very unique set of materials as it relates to one Union chaplain. So thank you for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you at a future webinar on Treasures from the Attic.